At 68 years old, Eleanor Vance stood in a sun-drenched law office and watched 38 years of marriage dissolve into a single signature. But what her husband Richard didn't know, what his team of high-priced attorneys had completely overlooked, was that the worthless asset they used to insult her was actually a key to his own destruction. This is a story about the moment a discarded woman stops being a victim and starts becoming a legend. If you have ever felt invisible because of the grey in your hair, if you have ever been told you are too old to start over, or if you have watched someone you loved walk away with the life you helped them build, you need to hear this. Subscribe now, because when that rusted door on the iron petrel finally yielded, it didn't just reveal a secret, it revealed a reckoning. Eleanor, whom everyone called Nora, had turned 68 that September. She had spent nearly 4 decades as the silent partner of Vance Construction. In 1982, she had used her own small inheritance to buy the first crane the company ever owned. She had sat at a kitchen table covered in blueprints and coffee stains while Richard slept. She managed the payroll for 30 men using a ledger she kept in a shoebox. During the housing crash of the 90s, she sold her mother's silver tea set to keep the lights on in the warehouse. She had been the one who stayed late at the office to handle the insurance claims after the accidents on the job sites. When Richard fell ill in 2005, she ran the entire operation for 6 months without a single mistake. She never drew a salary of her own. She believed the company was their shared future. She believed that marriage was a contract written in sweat and loyalty. She was wrong. Nora reached into the pocket of her wool coat and felt the cold, heavy brass of her grandfather's compass. It was a maritime instrument from the 1930s with a glass face that was slightly cracked. The needle was frozen toward the northwest. It didn't point the way anymore, but the weight of it kept her grounded when the world felt like it was spinning. It was the only piece of her history she had managed to take from the house. Everything else was staying with Richard and the woman who was 24 years younger than Nora. The office was on the 42nd floor. Outside the window, the city looked like a toy set built by people who didn't care about the people living inside it. The air in the room smelled of expensive cologne and ozone from the laser printer. Richard sat across from her. He wore a suit that cost more than their first 3 months of rent in the trailer. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the document in front of him. He looked at the clock on the wall. Nora remembered the nights in 1988 when the heat went out. She had wrapped their daughter in 3 blankets and spent the night calculating how much they could save by cutting their own lumber. She had learned how to read building codes and zoning laws by candlelight. Richard had been a good carpenter, but Nora had been the one who turned him into a businessman. She had written the speeches he gave at the Chamber of Commerce. She had picked out the ties he wore to meet the bank managers. She had been the architect of his success, but she was not on the deeds. The lawyers called it a standard prenuptial agreement that she had signed in a moment of youthful trust. They called it a clean break. She remembered the Christmas of '92. They had no money for gifts, so she spent 3 weeks sewing a coat for Richard from old army blankets. She told him she found it at a vintage shop so he wouldn't feel the sting of their poverty. She had spent her 40th birthday cleaning the grease traps at the new warehouse because they couldn't afford a maintenance crew yet. She had done the work of 3 people for the price of none. The lawyers didn't count the sewing or the grease traps. They didn't count the 38 years of making him look like a success. They only counted the signatures on the papers she had signed when she was 23 and in love. Richard pushed a single manila folder across the table toward her. "It's a boat, Nora," he said. His voice was smooth and practiced, the way he spoke to city council members. "A piece of history. You always said you wanted to be near the water." The folder contained the deed to the iron petrel. It was a decommissioned industrial barge moored in the silt canal. It had been used to haul gravel until the engine seized in 1970. The company had bought it for scrap value 10 years ago and forgotten it existed. It was a rusted box of metal sitting in a toxic waterway. Richard smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He checked his phone and started typing a message before she could even open the folder. Nora didn't argue. She didn't cry. She reached out and took the folder with hands that had handled more bricks and timber than Richard's ever would. She felt the weight of the compass in her pocket. She stood up and adjusted her coat. She walked toward the glass door. The door clicked shut behind her. Eleanor Vance sat on a wooden bench at the bus stop outside the towering glass office building. She was 68 years old, and the city air felt colder than it had an hour ago. She looked down at her hands and saw the faint, permanent stains of ink on her cuticles. Those stains were from 40 years of bookkeeping for a man who had just traded her for a newer model. Nora thought back to the winter of 1985, when the company was just a single truck and a pile of debt. Richard had been ready to walk away and find a job at the local mill. Nora had stayed up for 3 nights straight with a calculator and a pot of black coffee. She found the $3,000 in overhead that was killing them. She sold the pearl necklace her grandmother had left her to cover the insurance bond on their first municipal contract. She didn't tell Richard where the money came from. She told him the bank had finally seen his potential. She spent that entire year eating day-old bread so he could take clients out to steak dinners. She believed she was building a foundation for their family. She thought every late night was a deposit in a bank of mutual respect. The lawyers didn't ask about the pearls or the day-old bread. They didn't see the thousands of hours she spent in the unheated warehouse office while Richard was out making handshakes. She remembered the birth of their daughter, Sarah, in 1990. Nora was back at the ledger 3 days after coming home from the hospital. She balanced the accounts with a sleeping infant strapped to her chest. When the company truck broke down in '94, she was the one who crawled underneath it in the rain to tighten the fuel line. Richard had been at a golf tournament with the city planners. She had wiped the grease off her face and went back to the kitchen to start dinner before he got home. She never complained because she felt they were a team. She had trusted him because he was the man who had promised to protect her. She had trusted him because she thought work was the highest form of love. She looked at the manila folder in her lap and realized that for Richard, work was just a way to buy a different life. Nora reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass compass. She ran her thumb over the cracked glass face. Her grandfather had given it to her when she was 10. He had told her that a person who knows where they stand can never truly be lost. The needle remained stuck at northwest, vibrating slightly with the rumble of a passing bus. It was a heavy, cold weight in her palm. It was the only thing Richard hadn't tried to take because he thought it was broken. To him, things only had value if they functioned or showed off his wealth. He didn't understand the value of a thing that had survived a storm. She thought about the small house they had lived in during the early 90s. Every morning at 5 o'clock, she would make Richard's lunch. She wrapped his sandwiches in wax paper and tucked a small note inside every single day. She made sure his work boots were dry and his thermos was full of hot coffee. She had performed these small acts of service for over 13,000 days. She had done them because she believed they were the threads that held a life together. She realized now that Richard had simply walked through those threads without feeling them. He had seen her labor as a natural resource, like the gravel or the lumber he used for his buildings. He had used her up until the cost of maintenance was higher than the thrill of a replacement. The bus pulled up to the curb with a hiss of brakes. Nora didn't get on. She watched the doors open and close. She watched the people inside looking at their phones. She was a 68-year-old woman with a rusted barge and a broken compass. In the eyes of the city, she was a ghost, but ghosts have nothing left to lose. She looked at the address on the deed in the folder. The Silt Canal was at the very edge of the map. It was a place where things went to be forgotten. She stood up and adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. Her knees ached with the dampness of the air. She started walking toward the subway station. She didn't look back at the glass tower. The conference room was a cage of glass and silence. The morning sun hit the polished mahogany table and turned the water carafes into blinding points of light. Richard sat at the far end. He was wearing a charcoal suit that fit him like armor. Next to him sat a young lawyer with a briefcase that cost more than Nora's first car. Nora sat alone on her side of the table. She wore her best navy wool coat and held her grandfather's compass tightly in her pocket. She felt the cold brass against her palm. It was the only thing in the room that felt real. The lawyer began to read the terms of the settlement in a voice that sounded like dry paper. He didn't look at Nora once. He looked at the digital clock on the wall. Richard didn't look at her either. He was busy adjusting his cufflinks, his fingers moving with a restless, bored energy. He looked like a man waiting for a flight he was already late for. He looked like a man who had already forgotten the face of the woman across from him. "We're just being realistic, Nora," Richard said. He leaned back and spread his hands as if he were offering her a gift. "At your age, you can't manage a 5-bedroom estate alone. The taxes, the maintenance, the sheer scale of it. It's a burden you don't need anymore. You'll be so much more comfortable with a simpler life. This is what's best for everyone involved." He used the word everyone as if it included her. He used the word burden to describe the home she had scrubbed and painted for 30 years. He used the word comfortable to describe her exile. The lawyer flipped a page and slid a silver pen toward the center of the table. Richard checked his gold watch. "I've got a lunch meeting at 1, he muttered to his attorney. He didn't realize Nora could hear him. Or perhaps he didn't care. The casual way he dismissed her entire life was a sharper blade than the legal documents. He had already replaced her in his mind. The everyone he spoke of was himself, and a woman Nora had never met. The family estate to Richard, the mountain cabin to Richard, the 3 luxury vehicles to Richard, the offshore investment accounts to Richard. While they exchanged, practiced, professional nods, already calculating the next move for the firm, Nora received what they called the final asset. It was a single manila folder containing the deed to the iron petrel. It was a rusted industrial barge sitting in a canal that the city had abandoned 20 years ago. It was a floating coffin made of scrap metal. "You're not getting nothing," the lawyer said. He smiled a thin, oily smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're getting a property with significant historical character. It's a clean break. That's what you always said you wanted, wasn't it? Peace and quiet on the water." Richard finally looked up. He looked at Nora's grey hair and the lines around her eyes. "Let's be honest, Nora," he said. "I can't have the face of Vance Construction looking like a retirement home brochure. You did your part, but the company needs a different energy now. This settlement is more than fair for someone who hasn't been on a job site in a decade." Nora felt the compass needle vibrating against her thumb. She thought about the nights she spent calculating his payroll in the dark. She thought about the time she hauled bags of cement in her own car to finish a project on time. She had built the ladder he was now using to kick her in the face. She looked at the deed in the folder. She looked at the man who had slept beside her for 14,000 nights. He was a stranger in a charcoal suit. He was a man who thought he could buy his way out of a debt of the soul. Nora reached out and took the silver pen. Her hand did not shake. She signed the papers with the same precise script she used for 38 years of bookkeeping. She closed the folder and tucked it under her arm. She stood up slowly. Her knees clicked in the silent room. The lawyer began stuffing papers back into his briefcase before she was even away from the table. Richard was already back on his phone, his thumb flying across the screen. He didn't look up as she walked toward the door. Nora stopped at the threshold. She turned and looked at the back of Richard's head. "You think you're giving me the rust," she said quietly. Richard didn't turn around. "But you're giving me the foundation." She walked out into the hallway and didn't look back. The elevator doors closed with a soft hiss. Nora stood on the platform of the Broadway Lafayette station. The ceramic tiles on the walls were chipped and stained with decades of city grime. She felt the heavy weight of her leather bag pulling at her shoulder. Inside the bag was the manila folder, a single change of clothes, and a tin of loose-leaf tea. Everything else she owned was currently being packed into boxes by strangers Richard had hired. She pulled her phone from her pocket and tapped the screen. The battery icon was a thin, flickering sliver of red. She opened her banking app and watched the loading circle spin. The balance appeared in small, digital font, $48.12. This was the total sum of 38 years of labor. It was not enough for a hotel room in this zip code. It was not enough for a bus ticket to her sister's house in Oregon. The math of her survival was a cold, hard equation that didn't add up to a future. She scrolled through her text messages. There were no new notifications. The last message from her daughter, Sarah, was 3 weeks old. It was a photograph of a sunset in Tuscany. Nora had texted her 3 times since the final hearing. She had asked for a place to stay, just for a week. The messages remained unread. Richard had spent the last year paying for Sarah's graduate school and her European travels. He had bought her silence with a platinum credit card. Barnaby sat at Nora's feet and leaned his weight against her shin. He was a 12-year-old golden retriever with a coat that had faded to the color of old parchment. His muzzle was completely white. Richard had told the lawyers that the dog was too old for the new penthouse. He had called it a mercy that Nora take the animal with her. Barnaby's hips clicked audibly when he shifted his weight. He looked up at Nora with cloudy, trusting eyes. He didn't know they were homeless. He only knew that she was still holding the leash. Nora reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass compass. The metal was warm from her body heat. She held it flat in her palm and watched the needle. She remembered her grandfather telling her that the North Star doesn't move just because the ship is sinking. She looked at the deed inside the folder again. The address was written in a cramped, legal hand. 1400 Silt Canal Road. She had two choices. She could go to a shelter and wait for a bed among the broken and the lost, or she could go to the one place the law said belonged to her. She looked at Barnaby. The dog wagged his tail once, the tip of it thumping against a discarded soda can. He was waiting for a command. He was waiting for her to be the person she had been for 40 years. "Come on, Barnaby," she whispered. Her voice sounded thin in the cavernous station. She turned away from the uptown train that led to the suburbs and the life she once knew. She walked toward the stairs leading to the industrial bus line. Her knees ached with every step down into the dark. She didn't feel brave. She felt like a woman who had run out of exits. The bus was nearly empty. The windows were smeared with grease and rain. Nora sat in the back with Barnaby tucked between her legs. She watched the city change. The glass towers and boutiques faded into brick warehouses and chain-link fences. The streetlights were farther apart here. The silence of the outskirts began to settle over the bus. She held the compass tightly in her hand until the brass edges bit into her skin. She was going to a graveyard for ships. The bus driver didn't look back as the doors hissed shut. Nora stood on a patch of cracked asphalt at the end of the line. The silt canal smelled of salt, wet mud, and the sharp tang of oxidation. Barnaby let out a low whine and pulled at the leash. He didn't head for the shelter of the bus stop awning. He headed toward the water. Nora followed him down a narrow path between two rusted warehouses. The mud sucked at her shoes. The rain turned the world into a series of grey silhouettes. Barnaby stopped at the edge of a sagging timber pier. He barked twice at a dark shape floating in the black water. The iron petrel was worse than the photograph in the legal folder. It was a 60-foot slab of industrial steel, slumped heavily to the left. The orange paint had blistered away in giant flakes. A small, boxy cabin sat at the rear like a lonely tooth. The deck was littered with coils of rotted rope and broken glass. It looked like a grave for a giant. Nora felt a cold knot of regret tighten in her chest. Then she noticed the cleat at the edge of the pier. It was a heavy piece of cast iron bolted deep into the wood. Tied to the cleat was a mooring line of bright, white nylon. It was clean. It was strong. It was the only thing in the canal that wasn't decaying. Someone had been maintaining the connection. Nora pulled her grandfather's compass from her pocket. She held it flat, seeking some kind of direction in the gloom. "The needle won't help you tonight, Eleanor." The voice was a dry rasp that seemed to come from the pilings themselves. A man stepped out from a small shack with a faded green awning. He was wearing a heavy wool sweater and a fisherman's cap pulled low. He looked at the compass in her hand. Then he looked at her face. "I'm Elias Thorne," he said. Nora took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "How do you know my name?" The man didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "Arthur Vance told us you'd come eventually after he passed," Elias said. "He said to watch for a woman with a brass compass and a dog that doesn't quit." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy iron key. "We've been waiting for you for a long time." He handed her the key. The cabin of the iron petrel smelled of wet charcoal and 50 years of stagnant river air. Nora turned the iron key in the lock and pushed the heavy metal door. It groaned against the frame, shedding flakes of rust like dry skin. Inside, the space was 10 feet wide and 12 feet long. A rusted iron stove sat in the corner with a pipe that disappeared into the ceiling. A narrow cot, with a stained mattress, was bolted to the far wall. Dust motes danced in the beam of Nora's flashlight. She looked at her hands. They were already stained orange from the door handle. She had $48.12 in the world and a floating ruin. The first week was a war against the decay. Nora's routine began at 5 o'clock in the morning, when the fog was thickest. She put on her heavy wool coat and stepped onto the deck with a wire brush she found in a locker. She spent 4 hours every morning on her knees, scrubbing the oxidation from the steel plates. Her knees throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that started in the bone. Her lower back felt tight, as if the muscles had been replaced by dry twine. By noon, her hands were so stiff she had to soak them in warm water to straighten her fingers. She didn't have money for a sander or chemical strippers. She used the wire brush and a discarded putty knife. She salvaged a bucket of grey primer from a construction site dumpster 3 blocks away. She carried it back to the canal, one slow block at a time. Elias Thorne appeared on the pier every afternoon at 3. He didn't ask if she needed help. He simply left things on the edge of the timber boards. One day, it was a gallon of kerosene for the stove. Another day it was a heavy wool blanket that smelled of cedar and pipe tobacco. Once, he left a small jar of heavy grease for the door hinges. Nora would nod to him from the deck. He would touch the brim of his cap and walk back to his shack. They didn't speak about Richard or the law office. They spoke about the tides and the way the wind pulled at the mooring lines. Elias was a surveyor who had outlived his maps. He treated Nora like a captain, not a victim. The nights were the hardest. The iron petrel moved with the water, a slow, heavy sway that made the steel hull groan. Nora would sit on the edge of the narrow cot and look at her phone. The screen was cracked. She checked her messages every hour. There were no calls from Sarah. There were no texts from the friends she had hosted at dinner parties for 3 decades. The silence of the device was louder than the wind outside. She thought about the guest rooms in the family estate. They were empty and heated to 72 degrees. She was 68 years old and she was sleeping in a metal box. On the 10th night, a storm rolled in from the coast. The rain didn't fall. It slammed against the hull like handfuls of gravel. A leak developed in the corner of the ceiling directly over Nora's head. Icy water dripped onto her face and soaked into the mattress. She stood up and tried to move the bed, but the bolts were fused to the floor. She slipped on the wet metal and landed hard on her hip. The pain was sharp and sudden. She lay on the cold floor and listened to the water hitting the bucket she had placed in the corner. Plink, 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 she thought. I cannot fix a leaky roof. I am 68 years old, with $37 left, and I cannot fix a leaky roof. The math of the future was too large to look at directly. She looked at the phone on the small crate she used as a table. The battery was at 4%. No missed calls. No reminders of a life that mattered. She thought about calling Richard. She thought about telling him he was right. She thought about begging for a room in the basement of the house she had helped build. This is where I die, she thought. Not tonight, but this is where it ends. This is what dying alone looks like. She lay there for an hour, the cold from the steel seeping into her bones. Barnaby walked over and rested his heavy head on her shoulder. His breath was warm against her neck. He licked the rain from her cheek. Then, his tail thumped against a loose metal panel near the floor. The sound was hollow. It wasn't the dead thud of a solid wall. It was a ringing, metallic sound that echoed through the small cabin. Nora sat up. She reached out and felt the panel. It was a piece of brass plating, tarnished to a dark brown. She pulled the compass from her pocket. The needle, usually frozen, began to spin in a slow, frantic circle. The brass of the compass seemed to vibrate in her hand. She grabbed the wire brush and began to scrub the panel. She didn't care about the pain in her hip. She didn't care about the cold. She scrubbed until her knuckles bled, and the dark brown gave way to a dull gold. "I'm not dying in this shed," she whispered. Her voice was cracked, but it was steady. "I'm not dying because some man decided I wasn't worth keeping." She stood up and grabbed the putty knife. She jammed the blade into the seam of the brass panel and leaned her weight against it. She was still here. She jammed the putty knife into the narrow gap between the brass panel and the steel wall. The metal screamed as she leaned her full weight against the handle. The panel didn't just move. It groaned and popped forward. A small, square door swung open on a hidden hinge that had been painted over a dozen times. Inside was a shallow cavity lined with rotted, oiled silk. Nora reached in with trembling fingers. Her hand brushed against something cold and hard. She pulled out a flat brass box about the size of a cigar case. It was heavy for its size. She sat on the edge of the damp mattress and placed the box on her knees. The flashlight beam flickered, struggling to stay bright. Nora wiped the rain from her eyes with the back of her hand. The latch of the box was stiff, with decades of grime and salt air. She pressed her thumb against the catch and pushed. The lid clicked open with a sharp, metallic snap. The smell of old wax and dried ink filled the small cabin. Inside lay a stack of papers tied with a frayed blue silk ribbon. On top of the stack was a thick sheet of vellum with a heavy red wax seal. The seal showed a petrel with its wings spread wide over a crown. Nora untied the ribbon. The silk turned to dust between her fingers. Her hands were shaking so hard she had to grip the paper with both palms to keep it still. She read the first line. Then she read it again. She spoke aloud to the empty, leaking room. "Richard, you didn't look deep enough," she whispered. Her voice was barely a breath. Barnaby tilted his head and let out a soft huff. The document was not a standard industrial lease. It was titled, the Perpetual Sovereign Mooring License of 1926. It had been issued by the city's founding Maritime Commission. It didn't just grant the iron petrel a place to sit, it granted the owner of the vessel the permanent, untaxable right to occupy the waterway. But the second page held the real weight. The license included a legacy development easement. This easement granted the owner the right to build on the adjacent 50 feet of shoreline. Nora knew exactly where that shoreline was. It was the very ground where Richard's new luxury condo project was currently being surveyed. He had spent millions on the land, but he didn't own the water rights. He didn't own the access to the pier. Without this license, his multi-million-dollar project would have no legal path to the river. He had given her a rusted boat to humiliate her. Instead, he had handed her the only piece of paper that could stop his empire in its tracks. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her grandfather's brass compass. She placed it in the center of the vellum document. For the first time since she was a child, the needle began to move. It didn't seek the magnetic north. The needle spun once, twice, and then clicked into place. It pointed directly at a set of coordinates, etched into the bottom of the deed. Those coordinates didn't match the canal. They matched the exact center of the iron petrel's hull. Nora felt a strange, cold, calm wash over her. The pain in her hip was still there, but it felt distant now. She looked at the signature on the bottom of the development easement. The name was written in a flowing, elegant script. Thomas Thorne, Master Surveyor. The name Elias had mentioned on the pier. This wasn't an accident. Her husband had seen a liability he wanted to discard, but someone else had seen a legacy they wanted to protect. She picked up the flashlight and turned it toward the corner of the cabin. The water was still dripping into the bucket. Plink, plink, plink. She thought about her bank balance. $37. She thought about the 42nd floor of the glass office building. She thought about the way Richard had checked his watch while she signed her life away. He thought he was a master of the world because he had a charcoal suit and a younger woman. He didn't understand that the world is built on things that don't rot. Nora folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the brass box. She tucked the box under her pillow. She didn't try to move the bed again. She didn't worry about the leak in the ceiling. She lay back and pulled the cedar-scented blanket up to her chin. Barnaby jumped onto the bed and curled his heavy body against her legs. The storm continued to howl outside, but the iron petrel felt steady. It felt like an anchor. She closed her eyes and listened to the river. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the owner of the water. The math had changed. The morning after the storm, the sky was clear and pale. Nora stood on the deck of the iron petrel and looked at the rust. She did not see a ruin anymore. She saw a structural frame that had survived 50 years of neglect. She spent $32 of her remaining money at a small marine supply shop near the bus stop. She bought a gallon of industrial-grade sealant, a roll of bitumen tape, and a new scraper. She had $5.12 left in her account. The math of her survival was now a countdown. She spent the first 3 days on the roof of the cabin. She scraped away the layers of rotted tar and cracked rubber. Her knees were bruised a deep, dark purple from the hard steel plates. She didn't use a ladder. She hauled herself up, using the strength in her shoulders and her calloused hands. She applied the bitumen tape to every seam and joint. She poured the sealant over the patches and smoothed it with a flat piece of wood. That night, the fog rolled in, thick and damp. The cabin stayed dry. She turned her attention to the hull. She spent 6 hours a day with the wire brush and the scraper. She worked in a rhythmic, mechanical motion that blocked out the noise of the city. Scrape, brush, wipe. The orange flakes of rust fell into the canal like dead leaves. Beneath the decay, the steel was thick and solid. She found a half-empty can of battleship grey paint in a dumpster behind a shipyard. She mixed it with a quart of thinner she bartered from Elias for a tin of her tea. She painted the cabin first. The grey paint covered the stains and the grime. The petrel began to emerge from the shadows of the warehouses. She found a discarded mahogany door in a salvage yard 3 miles away. The wood was grey and weathered, and the glass pane was missing. The yard owner told her she could have it if she could carry it. Nora strapped the door to a discarded shopping cart she found in the weeds. She pushed the cart through the mud and over the broken asphalt. It took her 4 hours to reach the pier. She spent the next 2 days sanding the mahogany by hand. She didn't have a power sander. She used a block of wood wrapped in coarse sandpaper. Her fingers bled into the sawdust. She wiped the blood on her jeans and kept moving. She replaced the broken glass with a sheet of plexiglass she salvaged from an old bus shelter. She hung the door on the cabin using the grease Elias had provided for the hinges. The mahogany glowed a deep, rich red against the grey steel of the cabin. She spent her last $5 on a small bottle of brass polish. She went back to the hidden compartment behind the captain's station. She polished the brass nameplate until the letters were sharp and clear. Petrel, Port of London. O 1926. The metal didn't just shine. It caught the low afternoon sun and threw a beam of gold light across the dark water of the canal. The interior of the cabin changed one piece at a time. She scrubbed the floorboards with vinegar and salt until the wood smelled of the sea instead of rot. She found an old kerosene lamp in the hold and cleaned the glass chimney. She used a piece of discarded sailcloth to sew a cover for the narrow mattress. The space was small, but it was clean. It was no longer a place where things went to be forgotten. It was a captain's quarters. Elias walked onto the pier on the 10th day. He carried a small pot of yellow mums in a plastic container. He didn't say anything about the grey paint or the mahogany door. He looked at the polished brass nameplate. He looked at the way Nora stood on the deck, with her shoulders back. "The river remembers its own," he said quietly. He set the flowers down on the edge of the timber boards and walked away. Nora placed the yellow flowers on the small crate next to her bed. The color was so bright, it made the rest of the room look like it was in Technicolor. She stood on the deck as the sun began to set behind the warehouses. The iron petrel sat level in the water now. The grey hull was clean, the mahogany door was solid, the brass was bright. A group of tourists on a river cruise boat passed by the mouth of the canal. They pointed at the barge and took photographs. They didn't see a derelict vessel. They saw a piece of history that someone loved. Nora reached into her pocket and touched the brass box. She felt the weight of the sovereign license inside. The barge was no longer just a place to hide. It was a fortress. The petrel was rising. Nora woke before the sun touched the warehouses on the eastern bank. The ache in her lower back had faded to a steady, manageable hum. She stood in the center of the cabin and realized her feet felt heavy and planted on the floorboards. She did not reach for her phone on the crate. She did not check the battery or look for missed calls from the daughter, who was still in Tuscany. The digital screen was dark and covered in a fine layer of grey dust. She walked to the small mirror she had salvaged from a discarded dresser. Her hair was completely silver now, pulled back in a tight, practical knot. The lines around her eyes were deep, but her gaze was direct and clear. She looked like a woman who had finally stopped waiting for someone else to tell her she was alive. She stepped out onto the deck and felt the morning air on her face. The constant tightness in her throat had dissolved during the weeks of labor. Her lungs felt wide and cool. She sat on a small stool she had fashioned from a shipping crate and watched the tide come in. The water was a dark, obsidian green. She felt a sensation of warmth spreading from her chest to her fingertips. It was a physical weightlessness she hadn't felt in 40 years. She was not a wife, a bookkeeper, or a mother in this moment. She was simply a person on a boat in the center of a river. The piece was a solid, tangible thing, like the steel beneath her feet. She pulled the brass compass from her pocket and held it in the palm of her hand. The needle was steady now, pointing firmly at the center of the cabin floor. "I see what you did, grandfather," she whispered to the empty air. "You didn't give me a map to a place. You gave me a place where I couldn't be ignored." She ran her thumb over the cracked glass. "Richard thinks he took everything, but he didn't know that you can't take a foundation from a woman who knows how to build." She felt a strange sense of companionship with the man who had been gone for 20 years. The compass was a bridge between two people who understood that value isn't always found in a bank account. By 10 o'clock, the community began to arrive. It started with Matteo, a welder who worked at the repair shop 2 blocks away. He had seen the iron petrel from the bridge on his way to work. He didn't offer a handout. He brought a portable welding rig and a mask. "That railing is a hazard," he said, pointing to a jagged section of steel near the bow. He spent 3 hours fused to the deck in a shower of blue sparks. Nora made him a cup of tea and shared a loaf of bread she had baked in the iron stove. They spoke about the quality of pre-war steel. They spoke about the way the city was trying to pave over its own history. Matteo didn't ask for payment. He asked if he could come back on Saturday to look at the engine mounts. A young woman named Chloe arrived an hour later, with a sketchbook and a set of charcoal pencils. She sat on the pier and drew the mahogany door and the yellow flowers in the window. She told Nora that the art students at the college were calling the barge the Grey Lady. She said that people were tired of the glass towers and the sterile luxury of the new developments. They were drawn to the rust and the paint and the woman who was bringing it back to life. Word had spread through the local diners and the salvage yards. The story of the 68-year-old woman on the sinking barge had become a local legend. A retired longshoreman left a coil of heavy rope on the pier. A baker from the corner shop brought a bag of day-old rolls and a jar of honey. Nora didn't invite them, but she didn't turn them away. She made space on the deck for the visitors. She listened to their stories of lost jobs and closed shops. She realized that many of them felt just as discarded as she had been in the law office. The iron petrel was becoming a landmark for people who didn't fit into Richard's version of the future. She taught Chloe how to tie a bowline knot. She helped Mateo calculate the weight load for a new gangplank. She was no longer performing labor for a man who didn't value it. She was sharing her skills with people who saw her as an equal. The community formed organically, anchored by the grey steel and the red door. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Nora stood at the railing. She saw a black sedan idling at the end of the asphalt road near the warehouses. The windows were tinted. The car didn't belong in the industrial district. It looked like a polished beetle in a world of scrap metal. Nora knew who was inside the car. She knew Richard had heard about the Grey Lady and the crowds on the pier. He had heard that his worthless asset was becoming a local treasure. He had heard about the sovereign license from the city council members who were suddenly asking questions about his permits. Nora didn't hide. She didn't call Elias or Mateo. She simply stood at the railing with Barnaby at her side. She watched the black car for a long minute. Then she turned her back on it and went into her cabin. She had a pot of soup on the stove and a book to read. The car stayed for another hour before the engine roared and it sped away toward the city. Nora didn't look out the window. She didn't need to see his exit. She was already home. She was whole. The black sedan returned on a Tuesday morning when the tide was at its lowest. Richard stepped out of the car and stood at the edge of the asphalt. He was wearing a light grey summer suit and Italian leather loafers. He looked at the mud on the pier as if it were a personal insult. He looked at the iron petrel and the yellow flowers in the window. He didn't see the restoration or the pride in the steel. He saw a barrier to his progress. He saw a mistake he had made in a moment of arrogance. He walked down the pier with a stiff, unnatural gait. He stopped at the gangplank Mateo had built the week before. "Nora," he called out. His voice was loud and projected, the way he spoke at groundbreaking ceremonies. Nora stepped out onto the deck. She was wearing her work trousers and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. She held a paintbrush in one hand and a rag in the other. She didn't move toward him. She waited at the railing and watched him struggle with his balance on the timber boards. "We've been worried about you, Nora," Richard said. He stopped at the foot of the gangplank and tried to put on his sincere face. "I heard you were living down here in the silt. Sarah is distraught. She can't sleep thinking about you in this place. This isn't safe for a woman of your age. We're just being realistic. You belong in a proper apartment with heat and security." He used the same caring language he had used in the law office. He spoke about safety and family as if they were things he still understood. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She didn't mention the 3 weeks of silence from Sarah. She didn't mention the cold nights before the stove was fixed. "You didn't come here to talk about my safety, Richard," she said. Her voice was low and carried easily over the water. "You came here because the city council put a stay on your permits." Richard's face tightened. The mask of concern slipped, and for a second, the man behind the charcoal suit appeared. He looked small against the backdrop of the open sky. "I heard you found some old paperwork," Richard said. He tried to chuckle, but the sound was thin and dry. "Some ancient mooring license that doesn't mean anything in the modern world. My legal team says it's an oversight, a clerical error from the 20s, but it's causing a headache with the development bank. I'm here to make this right. I'll give you $100,000 for the barge and the license today. Think about it, Nora. You could have a real life again. You wouldn't have to scrape rust in the mud." He leaned forward, his eyes bright with the familiar hunger of a deal. "It's a clean break," he repeated. "This is what's best for everyone. This is what's best for everyone. You get the money, and I get to finish the project. It's a win-win." He smiled, that practiced, professional smile. He waited for her to thank him for his generosity. Nora walked down the gangplank, until she was standing eye to eye with him. She could smell the expensive cologne and the scent of air-conditioned offices. "You gave me this barge because you thought it was worthless," she said. "You gave it to me because you thought I was worthless. You thought 40 years of my life could be settled with a rusted box." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass box. She didn't open it. She just held it so he could see the weight of it. "This isn't a clerical error, Richard," she continued. "This is a sovereign license. It means you can't build your pier. It means your luxury condos don't have a view of anything but my boat. You should have planned better." She used his own words against him, letting them land like stones. Richard's face went from pale to a mottled, angry red. His hands balled into fists at his sides. "You can't hold up a $40 million project over a piece of scrap metal," he hissed. "I built that company. I made that name mean something." His voice rose, echoing off the warehouse walls. A group of neighbors from the pier began to gather behind Nora. Matteo stood there with a heavy wrench in his hand. Elias leaned against his shack, watching the scene. Richard looked at the people and then back at Nora. He realized he was no longer the most powerful man in the room. "You built the frame, Richard," Nora said quietly, "but I was the one who kept it from falling down. You forgot that a foundation is the part you can't see. Now, you're looking at it." She turned her back on him and started walking up the gangplank. Barnaby stood at the top, letting out a low, protective growl. "Nora," Richard shouted, "don't be a fool, you have nothing." Nora stopped at the mahogany door. She looked back over her shoulder. "I have the water," she said, "and you have the bill." She walked inside and closed the door. 1 year after the morning she arrived, the silt canal no longer smelled of decay. The air was clear and carried the faint scent of blooming jasmine from the new park on the shore. The iron petrel sat high and steady in its mooring. The grey hull was spotless and free of the orange flakes that had once covered it like a shroud. The mahogany door glowed with a fresh coat of linseed oil, its red grain deep and vibrant in the morning light. Nora stood on the deck and poured a cup of tea into a simple ceramic mug. She wore a heavy navy sweater and a pair of sturdy leather work boots. Her silver hair was loose around her shoulders, catching the first rays of the sun. Her hands were clean, though the calluses remained on her palms as a map of the work she had finished. The settlement from Richard's firm had been processed 3 months ago. The figure in her bank account was written in 7 digits. It was enough to buy a penthouse in the city or a villa on the coast of Italy. Nora had stayed on the boat. She had used the money to buy the 3 adjacent warehouses along the canal. One was now a community kitchen where the neighborhood gathered for hot meals. Another was a workshop where Matteo taught welding to local teenagers. The third was a gallery where Chloe displayed her sketches of the river. Richard's condo project had been redesigned by the city after the legal battle over the water rights. The glass towers were gone. In their place was a public park with oak trees that would grow tall over the next 50 years. The city had named it Vance Landing. The plaque at the entrance bore the name of her grandfather, Arthur. Richard had moved to another state, his name scrubbed from the local registry and his empire divided. Barnaby lay in a patch of sunlight on the deck. His coat was brushed and shiny, the color of winter wheat. His tail thumped a slow, happy rhythm against the steel. Nora reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass compass. She held it flat in her hand and watched the glass face. The crack was still there, a reminder of the night she almost gave up. But the needle was no longer stuck on the northwest point. It swung freely, circling the dial twice before settling on a perfect, steady north. It didn't point toward the city or the ghosts of her past. It pointed toward the center of the boat. The instrument was finally in balance. Nora looked out toward the mouth of the canal. The current was moving toward the open sea. She thought about the man who had given her the compass 60 years ago. "Grandfather, I finally know exactly where I'm standing," she whispered. The wind caught her words and carried them over the water. She took a sip of her tea and watched the first light hit the bridge. The bridge was full of people rushing toward their offices and their busy lives. Nora didn't have to rush anywhere. She was already there. Nora stood on the deck of the Iron Petrel as the city lights began to flicker to life across the water. She looked down at her hands in the deepening twilight. The permanent ink stains of the bookkeeping years were finally gone. In their place were the faint, silver scars of her own labor and the strength of her own grip. The world often treats the passage of time like the rusted hull of a decommissioned ship. It sees the oxidation and the peeling paint and assumes the engine has stopped forever. Richard saw a liability to be discarded to make room for a sleeker model. The high-priced attorneys saw a line item that could be erased with a signature. They forgot that the most durable parts of a structure are often the ones submerged in the cold and the dark. Eleanor's 38 years of sacrifice were not lost in the move. They were the seasoned steel that allowed her to survive the collision of her own betrayal. She did not need a penthouse to be significant. She did not need a husband's permission to be a captain. She simply needed to remember the coordinates of her own soul. The iron petrel still sits in the silt canal today. It is no longer a graveyard for forgotten things or a place of exile. It is a lighthouse for anyone who has been told their time has passed. It stands as a physical reminder that the most powerful thing a person can do is refuse to be finished. Value is not something given by a contract or a charcoal suit. It is something forged in the quiet hours of the morning and protected with a steady hand. Nora Vance turned 69 years old this past September. She is the owner of the water and the architect of her own peace. She doesn't look up at the glass towers of the city anymore. She looks at the horizon. If Eleanor's story moved you, if you have ever felt the weight of being discarded by the people you spent your life building, this moment of validation is for you. Leave the word foundation in the comments below to describe the strength you carry inside, because Nora's story proves something that is always true. Your history is not a burden to be hidden. It is the ballast that keeps you steady when the waves of life get high. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their best chapters are not written in the past, because together we prove that dreams don't age.